Almost 6 months have passed since the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor that gave birth to the Pacific War. In this half year, the Japanese Empire proved to be the one that was better prepared for war, and the one that held military superiority over its foes, as they rapidly steamrolled across the Pacific, capturing key points like Malaya, Burma, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and the island of New Britain, putting high pressure on important countries like Australia and India, and even making a big power like the US feel threatened over a possible invasion. The Empire of the Rising Sun was at its zenith, but things would quickly go downhill from this point forward. The surprising and fierce Doolittle Raid, as well as the carrier battle at the Coral Sea, had shown the weaknesses of the Japanese, and this forced Admiral Yamamoto to seek a decisive battle with his main enemy. Yet, unbeknownst to him, he was sailing into a trap that would forever change the course of history. Welcome to our video on the Battle of Midway, the event that finally put a stop to the expansion of the Japanese Empire. There's one other decisive World War II battle we'll briefly highlight here, the famous D-Day invasion, as our sponsor Magellan TV has a documentary on this called Days of Days, American Stories. It's a collection of personal stories from June 6, 1944, when Allied invaders faced extreme conditions and took extreme casualties to begin reversing the progress of Nazi Germany in Western Europe. Hear it told by the soldiers themselves, from the tense build-up in England to the chaos on the shores of France. And there's more content like that to see. Magellan TV has the richest and most varied history content available anywhere, covering everything from the ancient to modern eras, wars, biographies, and the Earth itself. Aside from history, they also give you extensive collections of science, true crime, travel, and other documentaries. They add 15 or more hours of 4K high-definition content every week for their subscribers at no extra cost. It's all viewable anytime, anywhere on televisions, laptops, mobile devices, and more. Get access to 3,500 hours of ad-free documentaries for only $4.99 a month, and get a month for free by subscribing to Magellan TV via our link in the description. As we've previously covered, the origins of Operation MI take us back to the aftermath of the Doolittle Raid, which saw Admiral Yamamoto victorious in his efforts to advance into the Central Pacific, with the ultimate goal of seizing Hawaii and decisively defeating the American Pacific Fleet. Yet for this, he had to make a compromise to deliver 2 of his fleet carriers for the planned invasion of Port Moresby. In the resulting Battle of the Coral Sea, the Japanese ambitions were checked by the arrival of an American carrier force under Admiral Fletcher, which managed to leave the carriers Shokaku and Suikaku unable to be employed in the invasion of Midway. The cost, however, was also heavy for the Americans, as they lost the carrier Lexington, while the Yorktown suffered moderate damage and had to be repaired. For more in-depth coverage of these events and their aftermath, don't forget to check out our latest episodes. On their estimates, the Japanese believed they had sunk both enemy carriers, so Yamamoto thought that his 4 remaining carriers of the Kido Butai would be more than enough to take Midway. But on the other side, American intelligence had successfully deciphered the Japanese plans of invasion. Admirals King and Nimitz knew when, how, and where the invaders were going to conduct their offensive, even having at their disposal the possible strength to be employed by the enemy. Immediately, the American admirals started to reinforce Midway for the incoming battle, while also preparing an ambush that had the potential to cripple the IJN. Although King was adamant to employ the 7 battleships that had survived the start of the war, Nimitz knew that the way to conduct naval warfare had changed with Pearl Harbor. His true striking power now lay with his aircraft carriers. In that regard, he sent the battleships towards the west coast, out of harm's way, while he endeavoured to have the Yorktown repaired as fast as possible. The other 2 carriers of Task Force 16, under Admiral Halsey, remained as his main force for the battle, along with the impressive 115 aircraft that had been jammed onto the island of Midway, which could provide him with the ability to have valuable reconnaissance over the enemy. Thus, Nimitz's carriers would be waiting under strict radio silence at Point Luck, a point 325 miles northeast of Midway, from where the Americans would launch an ambush intended to destroy half of the Japanese carrier force. This would be completely unexpected for Yamamoto, as he had envisioned to catch the Americans with their guard down and to achieve full surprise. First, he had planned to use Admiral Nagumo's carrier force to knock out Midway's air power with a surprise assault, reminiscent of that of Pearl Harbor. Then he would set up a seaplane base on Kure Island, while the invasion fleets advanced towards their objectives. A total of 5,000 SNLF Marines would land on Midway, while the Ichiki detachment was to seize the eastern island, and a force of 1,500 Marines was to capture Sand Island. Yamamoto expected that the Americans would have the bulk of their naval forces on Hawaii, leaving the Japanese ample time to quickly capture their objectives, build bases on them, and carefully lay a trap of their own that was to completely knock the Pacific Fleet out of the war. For this trap, the Japanese admiral had dispersed his overwhelming forces, including a secondary attack against the Aleutians that had the objective of making the enemy think that the odds were in their favor. Once the Pacific Fleet appeared to recapture Midway, the dispersed Japanese vessels would converge on the island to strike at the American Navy. For Yamamoto, the Japanese battleships would play a key role in the battle, tasked with engaging the enemy battleships and delivering a final blow against them. A large number of submarines from the 6th Fleet were also to be employed on the route of the American advance from Pearl Harbor to Midway, with the intention to scout their strength and cause them great attrition. Yamamoto has been harshly criticized due to this overly complex plan, and he was completely wrong to expect full surprise and to disperse his overwhelming forces. For instance, Yamamoto had devoted a considerable fleet, led by Admiral Hosagaya, to execute the invasion of the Aleutians, which included a carrier strike on Dutch Harbor and landings on Kiska, Adak and Attu. These were clearly secondary objectives, unworthy of the forces dedicated to seize them, leaving the invaders too far away to actually participate in any engagement at Midway. Furthermore, on May 27th, the operation was off to a bad start, as Nagumo's 1st Kido Butai departed Hashirajima anchorage one day later than scheduled. Even though this could jeopardize the entire initial strike at Midway, Yamamoto didn't see fit to make any adjustments to his plan. Unfortunately for him, Task Force 16 departed Pearl Harbor under strict radio silence the following day, with Yorktown doing the same. 72 hours later, she was in a battle-ready state, but her crews continued repairing her as she sortied. Although Nimitz had appointed Halsey to command the combined American forces, the senior admiral was in poor health due to a hard case of psoriasis, so the experienced Fletcher was given command of the defense of Midway, while Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance was put in charge of Task Force 16 out of a personal recommendation by Halsey himself. Upon assuming command, Fletcher launched 20 Dauntlesses to conduct reconnaissance, and he also moved his carriers to a new position 175 miles west of Point Luck. In contrast, Yamamoto's efforts to gather useful information over the enemy were also very lackluster, failing to execute a third attempt at Operation K due to the strong American presence at the French frigate shoals, and having the 6th Fleet's submarines arriving late at their scheduled scouting cordon, through which the American carriers had already passed. On the morning of June 3rd, due to Nagumo's late departure, the first Japanese fleet started to arrive in the vicinity of Midway, rapidly getting spotted by American PBYs and suffering some aerial attacks that failed to do heavy damage to them. Luckily for the Japanese, Nagumo's carrier force finally arrived in the area from the northwest, and then started to launch 108 aircraft, led by Lieutenant Commander Tominaga Joichi, to strike at Midway during the early hours of June 4th. Although Yamamoto had hoped to achieve full surprise, Captain Cyril Simard, the commander of the Midway garrison, had earlier sent an air patrol and 22 PBYs for search operations. This resulted in the interception of the Japanese force some 30 miles from Midway by 6 Wildcats and 18 F-2A Buffaloes, piloted by brave US Marines. Yet the ensuing air battle turned out to be a disaster for the defenders, losing 15 planes in the struggle and only shooting down 2 Zeros, due to the large superiority of the battle-hardened Japanese pilots. Tominaga would then go on to strike targets on Eastern and Sand Islands, heavily damaging support facilities there, but receiving much damage in return from anti-aircraft fire. By the end of the attack, the Japanese had failed to neutralize most of Midway's defenses and had also lost some 25 planes, which forced Tominaga to request a second wave to complete the job. Losses were particularly heavy on the carrier Hiryu, leaving it with only 8 torpedo bombers out of the 18 that it originally carried. While the Japanese attack was happening, another important event was taking place. During the early morning, the PBYs flying from Midway managed to spot 2 of Nagumo's carriers and alert Fletcher of their presence in the area. This was tremendously important, as whoever could attack the other carrier force first would have the upper hand in the battle. Whereas the Americans had wisely dedicated considerable resources for reconnaissance, Nagumo only devoted a total of 7 aircraft to fly to a range of 300 miles. After receiving the reports of the PBYs, Fletcher ordered Spruance's carriers to head south and strike at the enemy. The reason Yorktown's aircraft were reserved was because Fletcher was still unsure about the location of the remaining 2 Japanese carriers. At 0700, Spruance began the launch of his 116 aircraft. Although Hornet's planes quickly got into the air, Enterprise's launch didn't go exactly as planned, as their second deck load ended up delaying its liftoff, thus causing there to be 2 separate groups from the same carrier. Meanwhile, a wave of 6 TBF Avengers and 4 B-26 Marauders arrived from Midway to Nagumo's location and started to attack the carrier Akagi. The Japanese, however, had devoted 29 Zeros for air patrol, so the American aircraft were easy prey for the invaders. An hour later, the second wave, under Major Lofton Henderson, arrived and attacked the carrier Hiryu, but met the same fate as its predecessor. Half of the 16 dive bombers were shot down in the ensuing struggle, including that of Henderson. A third wave, consisting of 14 B-17s, and a fourth wave, consisting of 11 obsolete SB-2U-3s, then appeared, but yet again failed to score hits, with the loss of only 3 bombers. Around this time, Nagumo had also decided to prepare a second wave to attack Midway, using the aircraft that had been reserved to strike at the enemy carriers if they appeared. As he hadn't received any reports so far, he assumed that there weren't any enemy vessels in the area. Yet just as the strike group was being prepared, the Japanese reconnaissance got to detect a task force of at least 10 enemy ships in a stroke of luck. Upon receiving this fortuitous report, Nagumo suspended the second wave's strike, but his next decision was a true dilemma for him. The so-called Nagumo's dilemma left him 2 options: strike immediately with the forces at hand to take initiative, conducting a piecemeal attack and risking some incoming aircraft from Midway requiring to ditch, or wait for the returning aircraft from Midway to launch a full strike wave, because IJN doctrine did not endorse piecemeal attacks. He wasn't expecting the presence of enemy carriers so early on, and now most of his aircraft were not ready to execute a naval bombing. Although Rear Admiral Yamaguchi Tamon of the 2nd Carrier Division had called to launch an immediate strike, Nagumo decided to wait for confirmation that the enemy had carriers, and did not take any action, instead hoping to quickly recover the first wave planes, and thus giving the initiative to the Americans. In the meantime, Fletcher had also been alerted that his forces had been discovered by the enemy, so he decided to launch part of his aircraft in piecemeal attacks to support Spruance's strike against the 1st Kido Butai, which had departed almost 2 hours ago and was by now arriving at Nagumo's location. At 0915, just as almost all the first wave planes had been recovered, the first 15 Devastators started to appear on the horizon. These were Hornet's torpedo planes, which then fell upon the carrier Soryu, immediately getting engaged by the 18 Zeros that were on air patrol. In a matter of 20 minutes, all 15 Devastators were destroyed by the invaders, failing to hit any of the carriers, but preventing the Japanese from launching their own counterstrike. As the attack developed, Nagumo's carriers began to launch more and more fighters, which were running out of fuel to defend them. But now 14 Devastators from Enterprise headed against the carrier Kaga. They were yet again prevented from striking their objectives by the Zeros, but at least 5 of them got to survive the engagement. Meanwhile, the rest of Hornet's strike force had passed well north of the 1st Kido Butai, having been given bad coordinates for the attack. They would never locate the enemy and would have to return to their carrier or to Midway, with a few fighters getting ditched on the way due to low fuel. Luckily, Enterprise's dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Clarence McCluskey, managed to locate the Japanese vessels through an indirect route in spite of the bad coordinates. As they were arriving, so was Yorktown's air group, which had advanced on a direct route towards the enemy. Facing 41 Zeros on patrol, Yorktown's torpedo bombers, with an escort of 6 Wildcats, began their approach towards the Japanese carriers at 10:10. Most of the enemy fighters were drawn towards the Wildcats, resulting in a series of dogfights at low altitude that gave the 12 Devastators of Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey the opportunity to launch a deadly attack over the carrier Hiryu. At the same time, with most of the Zeros distracted with the pursuit of Yorktown's torpedo bombers, McCluskey's and Yorktown's bombers managed to get close unnoticed and started to drop their bombs over the carriers Soryu and Kaga. By 10:25, 4 bombs managed to hit Kaga, while 3 hits were scored on Soryu, causing extensive damage on them and lighting up an inferno over the carriers. Seeing that Akagi might survive the attack unscathed, Lieutenant Richard Best and 2 bombers from Yorktown aborted their dives on Kaga and struck Akagi's port side with full surprise. Best himself managed to score a hit on the aft edge of the middle elevator, penetrating the upper hangar and causing a huge explosion among the fueled aircraft. Between 10:35 and 10:45, the last of the strikes was carried out by Massey's Devastators, getting to launch torpedoes against Hiryu but failing to hit the carrier. With the end of the attack, the Americans had lost a total of 67 aircraft, but had destroyed 14 Zeros and inflicted mortal damage on 3 carriers. Soryu and Kaga sunk that afternoon, with the loss of 1,522 lives, but Akagi took the longest to die. With a shocked Nagumo, who refused to leave his flagship, the carrier had to be abandoned eventually, then getting scuttled the next morning by orders of Yamamoto himself. Admiral Yamaguchi, in command of the last remaining carrier, immediately received orders to launch a counterstrike after the departure of the Americans. Mustering 36 aircraft under Lieutenant Kobayashi Michio, reinforced with 27 Zeros that were on patrol, the strike group was launched at 10:50. Meanwhile, Yamamoto and Kondo's fleet started to advance eastwards to support Nagumo, who upon getting to the cruiser Nagara had decided to turn north to intercept the American vessels with his surface units. At 11:55, Kobayashi spotted Task Force 17 and began his attack on Yorktown. Yet his fighter escort was miles behind, so when 5 Wildcats emerged to intercept them, the Japanese formation was shattered. Only 7 of Kobayashi's bombers managed to survive the interception, then approaching Yorktown from 2 directions. In the resulting strike, the experienced Japanese pilots expertly maneuvered around the enemy carrier and managed to strike 3 hits and 2 near misses, starting large fires all over Yorktown in one of the most accurate attacks of the war. Although the Japanese had lost 13 of their bombers, Yorktown had come to a stop and looked like it had received mortal damage, so Fletcher decided to move to the cruiser Astoria, while Spruance sent a small force to support the burning carrier. Upon getting notified of the successful strike by Kobayashi, Admiral Yamaguchi decided to commit his few remaining aircraft, the ones that had retreated from the Midway attack with many casualties, for a second assault against the Americans. Led again by Tominaga, the makeshift force of 16 aircraft was launched by 13:30 when Kobayashi's group was recovered. At this point, Yorktown's fires had been put out and the boilers had been restored, so when Tominaga got sight of Task Force 17 at 14:30, he didn't know he was attacking the same carriers Kobayashi had attacked hours ago. the Japanese were met by 6 Wildcats on patrol, with 8 more coming to reinforce them from Task Force 16. This time, however, the Zero escorts were used effectively, giving Tominaga's 5 torpedo bombers the chance to dive against Yorktown. Flying a damaged plane, Tominaga himself was the first to dive in, getting flamed by the defenders, but managing to maintain control of his burning bomber to make an excellent torpedo drop. Unfortunately, his torpedoes missed, as did his other wingmen's shots, so the sacrifice of the 5 torpedo planes would go unrewarded. But then entered the second 5 torpedo bombers of the invaders, surviving several attacks by Wildcats to launch 4 torpedoes against Yorktown. 2 of these torpedoes hit the port side of the carrier, causing Yorktown to halt and list with a devastating effect. The 5 torpedo planes would go on to survive the struggle and return to Hiryu with 4 of their escorts, while the Americans, having lost 4 Wildcats, prepared to abandon the listing carrier. While this attack was happening, American aircraft spotted Nagumo's forces coming towards Task Force 16. At 15:30, Spruance launched Enterprise's 25 Dauntlesses, led by Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher, to finish off the last Japanese carrier. While preparing a third strike for the afternoon, Yamaguchi was taken by surprise by the appearance of American aircraft at 1700. With the 13 Zeros on patrol outnumbered, Gallagher's bombers began to dive against Hiryu just 5 minutes later. Although they lost 3 Dauntlesses, 4 hits were achieved against the carrier, penetrating the hangar deck and setting Hiryu aflame. In the old tradition, Yamaguchi decided to go down and perish with his ship, while the rest of the crew was evacuated. He was arguably the best carrier officer of the IJN, making it a huge loss. 31 dive bombers from Hornet then appeared, heading to attack targets of opportunity but failing to hit any. With the last attack of June 4th concluded, Yamamoto still hoped to salvage the situation and achieve a decisive victory. He replaced Nagumo for Kondo due to his failure, and ordered the 2nd Kido Butai to come south and sent the submarine I-168 to shell Midway. But the 2nd Kido Butai couldn't start to move until June 5th, thus leaving the Japanese forces in a vulnerable position and forcing Yamamoto to order the final cancellation of Operation MI during the early hours of June 5th. Furthermore, upon assuming command of the American forces, Spruance had expertly avoided getting lured into any surface engagement, which was what Yamamoto was trying to do off Wake Island. By midday, Spruance managed to launch strikes against the retreating Japanese forces, but could only find the destroyer Tanikaze, which shot down 4 aircraft and expertly avoided getting damaged. Additionally, Admiral Kurita's 4 cruisers were left very exposed and suffered an accident while trying to evade an American submarine. After surviving an attack by Midway's aircraft, the cruisers Mogami and Mikuna suffered a new strike by Spruance's forces. The damaged Mogami was hit twice, while Mikuna received 5 direct hits and soon sank into the ocean. After suffering 1 more hit, the heavily damaged Mogami managed to escape and rendezvous with Kondo the next day. Meanwhile, salvaging efforts were being conducted on Yorktown, and it appeared like the carrier could be successfully salvaged. Yet the sudden appearance of submarine I-168 finally killed Yorktown, hitting her with 2 torpedoes and also ripping apart the destroyer Haman with another torpedo hit. At 0500 on June 6th, the carrier finally sank into its final slumber. Nonetheless, the battle had been a huge success for the Americans, only suffering the loss of some 144 aircraft on top of the vessels recently described. In turn, the Japanese had lost all 4 of their carriers and the cruiser Mikuna, as well as some 248 aircraft. Nimitz's gamble had been successful, and it would take a long time for the Japanese to recover from these losses. With their carrier force crippled, the Japanese would lose the initiative in the war, and now it was time for the Americans to go on the offensive. Next week, however, we'll cover the only Japanese victory in this whole fiasco, as they embarked on the invasion of the Aleutian Islands near Alaska. If you don't want to miss any episodes, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.